Hey everyone, it's great to be back with you all again, and welcome to my new green screen setup! I hope y'all like it took a really long time to set up. A new mainline Final Fantasy has come and gone, and the results were pretty mixed, to put it mildly. There's a lot to talk about, whether it's the change-ups in gameplay, the direction of the story, or how the game fits and ranks among the other Final Fantasy titles. Did it live up to the hype? Was it truly worthy of a Game of the Year award? Strap in, and let's talk about how well Final Fantasy XVI turned out. Developed by Square Enix Creative Business Unit 3, including producer Naoki Yoshida, also known as Yoshi P, director and producer of Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn, and Ryota Suzuki, previously with Capcom for his work on the Devil May Cry games, Final Fantasy XVI would see the series take some new and unexpected directions. Taking place in a set of continents called Valisthea, 6 different nations maintain a balance of power through the use of magical crystals. This balance is enforced through the use of dominants, humans who essentially act as hosts for each nation's mythic beast, known as icons. The scale eventually begins to tip, and war breaks out between these nations as a mysterious event called the Blight begins to take over the lands and remove all magic in its path. The game stars and focuses on a character named Clive Rosfeld, training to be what's known as a shield to his brother Joshua, the dominant of the Phoenix. After witnessing a horrible betrayal, partially orchestrated by their own mother, Annabella, Clive gets thrown into chaos as the nations continue to fight each other for control and dominance. After attempting to save the life of Jill, a close friend of his from childhood, Clive is found and taken in by Cid, the leader of an underground group. He enlists in the help of Cid and goes on a quest for vengeance, all in the hopes to confront Joshua's killer and silence the inner demons that continue to haunt him. If the plot sounds like it resembles a lot of the setting and story found in Game of Thrones, you wouldn't be the only one to think so. The game's setting and first few hours clearly take inspiration from this, and use it to some impressive degree. The game of course takes its own direction not long after this, and puts Clive and his companions in the middle of a war between nations, with little ability to actually do anything about it. At first. What follows is a unique, yet familiar tale with detailed characterizations, creatures of all shapes and sizes, epic battles between icons and their dominants, plot twists in every direction, and a setting that is as fantastical as it is dreary. In typical Final Fantasy fashion, Masayoshi Soken, composer of soundtracks for Final Fantasy XIV, Drakengard 2 and 3, and many other games from Square Enix, has delivered another success with the game's OST. While a few songs felt a bit less memorable to me, I didn't find a single song that I disliked in the bunch. There also seemed to be a few songs that resembled previous entries in the series, such as the main battle theme, which reminded me of Don't Be Afraid from Final Fantasy VIII, and I mean that in the best way possible. I believe this soundtrack deserves to be listened to on its own without any gameplay to distract you, as you'll notice all kinds of amazing connections between each song, as Soken is no stranger to the leitmotif approach in his compositions. This helped me appreciate it all the more. Even more remarkable is the fact that he worked on both the soundtrack to this and Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker, all while battling cancer, truly a legend in his own right. This may not reach all the same heights of 14's soundtrack for me, but I still very much enjoyed it. Never one to shy away from changing things up, the gameplay has once again seen some major revisions, stepping even further into the realm of action-based combat. Clive can make slash combinations with the square button and quick dodge with R1. He can also lock onto specific enemies with L1 and cast quick attack spells with triangle. But the real draw here is the icon abilities, which Clive slowly acquires throughout the adventure. Each of these allows you to equip up to 2 abilities at a time, which can be activated by pressing circle for the main attack or ability, and R2 plus square or R2 plus triangle to use. You can switch between up to 3 of these icons at a time with the L2 button. The abilities also have recharge or cooldown times, which can be affected depending on your equipment. You also have item shortcuts through the D-pad, which you can use for potions, tonics, and other things. While it doesn't add to the battle significantly, I'd still rather have these functions than not. The game also awards you for precision dodges and counterattacks. By hitting R1 to dodge at just the right moment, you'll activate a precision dodge, which gives you the chance to immediately counter the attack with a sword strike of your own. Striking just as the enemy is about to strike you as well will actually freeze time for a few seconds, giving you a chance to unload more combination attacks before the enemy comes to. You can also block and counter using the Titan icon slightly later in the game, which works in a similar manner. Enemies also have a defense meter that, when broken, will put the enemy into a staggered state, allowing you to unload your favorite flurry of attacks before it's built back up and the enemy rises again. It's also possible to run up to smaller enemies when they've been knocked down and perform another special attack, usually changing the camera angle to showcase it in a more cinematic fashion. I never got tired of pulling them off. After winning battles or completing certain side quests, you gain ability points, which can be used to level up these abilities and increase things like the attack duration, amount of time taken to recharge the ability, attack power, etc. While I wouldn't call this system super deep, especially compared to titles like Devil May Cry or Dragon's Dogma, the ability changes and precision dodging do manage to keep you on your toes. I appreciated the idea of what the developers were going for in this instance. And of course, what Final Fantasy would be complete without limit breaks? Yes, as you progress into the story, Clive eventually unlocks a limit meter. The gauge fills up from fighting enemies, getting hit by them, or using special items to boost it. He can take advantage of this at any time by pressing L3 and R3. This strengthens Clive's attacks and speed, while slowly healing him at the same time. It ends up becoming very useful for taking down staggered enemies and healing when you're in a pinch. Altogether, I'd say it's certainly fun to use, even if it's not quite as deep as I would have liked. While a longtime player of Final Fantasy and other RPGs, I'm also a longtime fan of third-person action games like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta. Those games were known for letting you take each ability and piece of equipment you had, and letting you switch between them mid-attack, to allow for even deeper combinations. Here, you can still switch between different icons to use other types of attacks, but there aren't many ways to use them all together, aside from unleashing one after the other. While I wasn't expecting the same level of depth as you'd get in other RPGs, I was hoping to see at least a few more elements thrown into the mix. Elemental damage, for example, is non-existent. Using a fire attack against a fire enemy will do the same amount of damage as an ice attack, etc. There is no weakness, resistance, or status effects to speak of here, and that stuck out to me like a sore thumb. Again, more than workable, and not a bad attempt for this type of gameplay at all. I just wish there could have been a little more to it to really stand out as something special. I was also pretty let down by the fact that you have no real control over your party members outside of Torgal. I suppose the developers were trying to have you focus on Clive specifically, as the nature of the game's combat is pretty hectic as it is. But it was a real shame not being able to issue commands to Jill, Cid, Gav, and the others, or be able to use them in any more strategic method. Aside from this, I think the real issue that could cause boredom for the player is the lack of enemy skills and abilities throughout the game. It's like you're given all kinds of amazing powers with little opportunity to really test them out, due to the lack of a real challenging boss until the latter parts of the game. And on this note, I will say I was a bit shocked by just how easy I found the game to be. And no, before you ask, I didn't use any of the charms to make the game easier. Aside from a few very specific hunts, trials, and side quests, which I'll cover more on later, as well as some of the final boss fights, I found almost no challenge in the entire game, as the majority of it really did feel like baby's first action game, with no real way to increase the game's difficulty until you reach Final Fantasy mode, which I'll get to later on. Now, does this mean that I didn't have fun with it, or that the game ended up being a letdown to me because of this? No, not at all. While I did feel bits of repetition here and there from the difficulty, I still found myself enjoying the combat system and experimenting with it about 9/10 of the time. Landing knockdown hits and using attacks like Rising Flame on large groups of enemies rarely got old, and for a game that I played through 2 times in full to get the Platinum Trophy, that's saying quite a bit. We still have one more gameplay type to talk about, but I'd like to save it for just a little later when we delve more into the game's story, as I feel it all goes together quite well. In the meantime, let's talk about the other things you can do outside of the main story, as the game certainly finds plenty of other ways to keep you busy. Between major missions in the game, you can return to your hideout, which serves as the game's main hub for buying items, crafting equipment, and helping update other members as to what you're doing or need to do next. Although I think the crafting system could have been a lot deeper, it still did what it needed to as far as laying out the recipes, i.e. the list of items or ingredients, for me to know what to craft and what I needed for it next. As you proceed through the story, you begin to unlock side quests, and at a later point, hunts and trial missions. The side quests are one of the biggest things talked about online and in other places involving Final Fantasy XVI discussions. Why? Well, let's get into that now. The side quest structure in 16 is very similar to Final Fantasy XIV's as well as many other popular RPGs out there. You find and locate characters with green exclamation marks over their heads or look them up with the map, talk to them and accept their quest, go to the requested area to talk with people or fight monsters, and then return to the quest giver for your rewards. The reason these are getting discussed online in such a mixed way is because a lot of these really do amount to simple fetch quests, or reaching from point A to point B, with little difference in the structure. With that said, there were plenty that I did find to include interesting bits of lore or story, especially in the final chapters. A few of these were so well done, I felt that they could have even been their own separate DLC if Square Enix felt like going that route. That said, it's a shame that most of these more interesting quests occur so late in the game, as you have quite a bit of the more tedious missions to deal with before it, and that can feel like a drag when you're just trying to get through it all. Luckily, most side quests are rarely required, though still recommended, as you unlock fairly important key items and stat improvements by completing them. And the game still gives you plenty of other things to do outside of the main story missions. Hunts are another option, for example. Similar to games like Monster Hunter, these missions involve you looking up a monster, its difficulty ranking, and its location, which is not always provided, in order to find it and defeat it. You could essentially look at these as the game's optional bosses, and I'd be hard-pressed to disagree. Some of the hardest fights in the game, like Savarg, are also included here, and the rewards you gain from these are vital for crafting. And as if that wasn't all enough, you also begin to unlock trials in the latter parts of the game. These are sort of like special challenges, where you get put into stages to fight groups of enemies, while having to utilize specific abilities from one icon and take down a boss at the end. These also have time limits, but enable you to gain more time by fulfilling certain challenge requirements that typically involve using your icon abilities in the most effective of ways. Some of these did give me additional pause, but I was eventually able to learn and master them all. While being a fun set of challenges, these were also great for learning how to use your abilities to the greatest of their potential. Still looking for more things to do? Well, step right up to the Arate Stone in your hideaway. From here, you can choose an environment to train and practice your abilities in, an arcade mode which allows you to replay any main stages you previously completed with limited items and a ranking system, a normal stage replay that lets you not only revisit the same story moments and cutscenes, but allows you to locate any items that you might have missed before. It helps that there's no restrictions on level or items here either. And finally, after unlocking New Game Plus and choosing Final Fantasy mode, you can choose Ultimaniac mode, which lets you replay stages, but with change-ups like new enemy placement and more challenging foes. For people like me who found the rest of the main game to be a little too easy, this was a step in the right direction. I was surprised to see no additional minigames or anything else that would have changed up the gameplay style itself, though. I wouldn't say it was absolutely necessary to have one, of course, just that I'm surprised we didn't get at least one, especially after seeing so many come out of Final Fantasy VII Remake just a few years ago. And now, it's the moment you've been waiting for. We're going to talk about the game's story, and yes, there is quite a bit to talk about. I've avoided most major game spoilers up to this point, but from here there's no turning back, okay? Okay. So the game begins with quite a heavy turn of events. Within the first few hours, we are brought into a pretty dark medieval fantasy setting, complete with a major betrayal, and several main characters thrown into extremely traumatic situations, like Clive and Joshua's entire kingdom being brought down, and Clive believing he witnessed Joshua being murdered by a mysterious fire icon. This game received an M rating, and it was not afraid to use it. 13 years later, Clive is thrown into slavery by his mother Annabella, and forced to aid in Sanbreque's army. He does so until one mission when infiltrating between enemy lines during a battle between the Iron Kingdom and the Dalmekian Republic. where he discovers that the Iron Kingdom's dominant is in fact his childhood friend Jill, now enslaved and being forced to use her magic for them. From this moment, Clive turns the tide and goes back on Sanbreque by defeating his comrades and freeing Jill. The two of them are then found and picked up by a man named Cid, who agrees to help Clive find the dominant of fire. Clive's mission becomes one of hate and revenge, as the death of his brother still weighs heavily on his thoughts and actions. He continually chases after another dominant of fire to obtain some answers.
What's that?
The dominant. The man who killed my brother.
Are you absolutely certain?
I've seen him every night for the past 13 years. Watched as the flames of his icon took Joshua.
Ow!
The next chapters focus on Clive coming to terms with the truth, that he was indeed Ifrit's dominant and the one who killed Joshua. This moment leads to both a mental and physical transformation that echoes Final Fantasy IV in its approach. By hitting L3 and R3, we have quote-unquote accepted the truth, and begun the path that would shape the rest of the game. From this point forward, Clive's path changes from one of vengeance to that of redemption, to join Cid's cause and destroy the Mother Crystals that have been draining the Aether away, and stop the Blight once and for all. Of course, things are never quite so simple. Once the team reaches Sanbreque and invades the capital, they come across a strange being known as Ultima. After it attempts to possess Clive, Cid interferes and manages to stop him, though not without taking a huge blow himself. After Clive comes to and faces off with the being, his brother Joshua reveals himself to Clive and manages to contain Ultima using the Phoenix's ability. Cid is no more. Although Clive and Jill are understandably set back by everything that's occurred, they do manage to press on. 5 years pass. Clive has now taken on the role of Cid and continues to carry out his mission, taking refuge in a new hideout with all the surviving members of Cid's party. Their goal of destroying the crystals remains the same, as Ultima continues to work behind the scenes to carry out his own sinister plans. These include using Clive, dubbed Mythos by Ultima, to essentially create a new world, using Aether gathered from the destroyed Mother Crystals, and joining together with Mythos after reaching his full potential. Overall, I felt the majority of the game's story to be very engaging, and the general world building we began to see, even within the game's first few hours, was truly impressive. The game deals with a lot of heavy topics, including warring nations, deception among both Ultima and multiple main characters, and most importantly, slavery. The latter was also quite a controversial topic due to a lack of diversity in the game's cast. Some, understandably, saw this as a form of erasure, as the implementation of slavery in the story was clearly meant to reference that of real-world events, including the use of quote-unquote branding as a marker or form of identification, or various underground channels and figures working to help or improve the lives of the branded. This only makes things even more disappointing when the story focus shifts away from the world that we spent the majority of the game building up, only to focus on the usual tropes where the main character has to essentially kill a god in order to save humanity. Aside from a few interesting late-game side quests, including one about Valistea's true history, and those trying to keep it hidden, these subjects are never really touched on again and just kind of left hanging while Clive goes off to save the world. It's a real shame, as I found the first 2/3 of the game to be quite interesting and would have loved to see more come of it. It's not to say that the final moments were bad to me or anything, just that it seemed like we were going to get something more unique than what actually came about. I also couldn't help but feel like parts of the story were missing. Don't get me wrong, this game felt like more of a complete experience than, say, Final Fantasy XV did, before all of the updates and DLC, but there were multiple parts of the story that felt barely touched upon. Cid, for example, clearly knows who Ultima was, though we have no idea why. I was expecting Clive or the other main characters to possibly come across some writings of his, or another person among Cid's ranks who may have known, but this wasn't meant to be. I also really wanted to learn more about Barnabas, as it seemed like there was clearly so much more to him and his motivations that we'll never get to learn about now. There was also the matter of Joshua not revealing himself to Clive for many years, after Clive believed himself to have killed Joshua. While I could make some educated guesses as to why, like having to remain in hiding so as not to attract Ultima's attention, etc., I don't believe this was ever fully explained either. The other elephant, or should I say icon, in the room is Leviathan, the only icon not actually seen in the entire game, despite it being considered of equal importance among the others. Some are predicting that this will get touched on in a future DLC, but based on what was stated about Clive and his entire purpose being to obtain and wield the powers of each icon before being presented to Ultima, it seems very odd that this one would be left out as such. I will also add that Final Fantasy mode, the game's harder difficulty after unlocking New Game Plus mode, is not as well made as the one in Final Fantasy VII Remake, as there are less new things to do and gain in it outside of crafting stronger versions of the same items by getting 2 of each. I want to say that all in all, the fact that I wanted more from this world and its characters is testament to the fact that I really enjoyed them. As far as the story itself goes, this may be the most fun I've had with a single-player mainline Final Fantasy since probably 10, if not 12. The nods to the title's past and elements that help shape a Final Fantasy experience are still here, even with a risky gameplay model alongside it. Okay, we've covered a lot of material here, but there's one major focus left to discuss, because let's face it, when talking about what people will remember most about this title, one main thing stands out. Yes, it's the icon battles. Following each Dominance transformation, you essentially get a bunch of Final Fantasy summon characters going at it, in a style that somehow combines the wildest parts of franchises like Godzilla and Dragon Ball all at once. The sheer spectacle and dynamics of these fights are absolutely wild, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't sitting back in awe watching all these play out. Unfortunately, with so much spectacle comes a bit less substance, at least when it comes to the gameplay behind it. Icon movement is understandably a little slow, but the amount of things you can actually do in these battles are severely limited, at least until the next cutscene or button press sequence comes about. While I don't want to say that this ruined anything for me, as the fights themselves were incredible and still immensely fun to experience, I could understand some being taken back by the lack of strategic gameplay during them, as most of the fights really do play themselves out in the style of QuickTime Event, or QTE, heavy titles like Ashura's Wrath. The fights with both the Titan and Bahamut icons were easily the biggest highlights of the entire game, both in terms of the fight choreography and the stakes behind those battles. No matter what side of the fence you're on, these icon battles will likely go down as one of the major highlights of this game, and deservedly so in my opinion. So, what to make of it all? What did I think of this game in the end? Did it deserve a Game of the Year nomination? I'm not going to lie to you, I had a very hard time deciding how I felt about all of this in the end. So much so that the script for this episode actually underwent multiple rewrites, something I rarely ever do. If I could use one word to describe my final thoughts on this game, it would be conflicted. For everything I loved and enjoyed about it, there seemed to be something else there to counterbalance it. For example, I had a great amount of fun learning new attacks and finding ways to use them in conjunction with others for my favorite attacks. At the same time, you reach a point where most fights begin to play out the same way, with little differences between them outside of the boss battles. This only becomes more apparent during New Game Plus mode, where the enemies become even greater damage sponges, causing you to repeat the same strategies for an even longer period of time. One of the things I greatly appreciated about action titles like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta was the sheer variety in attack patterns you could follow, and the ability to meld all sorts of combination attacks together using different weapons and equipment. This game, unfortunately, doesn't quite reach that level of depth. While the attacks they do give you are very nice and somewhat varied, and the block and dodge mechanics are surprisingly well made, the rest could have used a little more tweaking. I believe adding more RPG elements like status effects or elemental damage could have worked wonders here as well. Another example of this conflict is the game's narrative and story. I believe that the world crafted was legitimately interesting to the point where I wanted to learn more about it and its main characters, but unfortunately somewhere past the halfway point it just stops. The story shifts into your typical man versus god narrative and almost completely throws all of its world building out the window. And then there's the side quests. I believe there were some truly rewarding missions to come out of this, especially near the game's final moments, but the majority of these were far from it, and just felt needless and repetitive. While I believe this style worked well enough in Final Fantasy XIV, it didn't quite flow the same way here. I guess what this all comes down to is that I certainly enjoyed the experience I had with this game. I just felt like it could have been more. Had there been more intricate combat, more RPG elements, control over your party, better customization, a slightly higher difficulty, more meaningful side quests, or at least less repetitive ones, and a more focused narrative that stayed the course, then I believe we could have had something truly revolutionary. Had this game come out in 2022, or any other year that we weren't surrounded by hit after hit, then I would have easily considered this for a Game of the Year nomination. As it stands currently, I can understand it being left out, as much as it pains me to say. But it's not all bad. I still believe this was a great game overall, and as I said before, easily had one of the most engaging casts and stories I've seen in a mainline single-player Final Fantasy in a very long time.
The only fantasy here is yours, and we shall be its final witness.
Did he just... As you can see, I liked and disliked things about this game. It was very conflicting, but I still appreciated the experimentation and the effort that the team put into making it possible. Whether you're a turn-based purist or an action game aficionado, I recommend you at least try the game, maybe through a rental or something of that sort, to see how you truly feel about it as well. The opinions are mixed for a reason, and who knows where yours will go on that same scale. And that's going to do it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Have you played this game before yourself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're feeling generous, please consider supporting my Patreon, where awesome people like Erica, Jedi Dude, Brandon, and CLO all help to keep this channel going. Until next time.